Greeting, stranger. Welcome to Almas, the opulent capital of Andoran, the birthplace of freedom. I have changed our touring plans slightly, but for the better, I think. The captain of this ship still owes me a favor or three, and has agreed to sail us northwards up the water beyond her usual portside stop, so that we can experience this center of democratic government from the ship's deck. As will become obvious in a few minutes, Almas is split across no fewer than 5 parcels of land by the confluence of 4 rivers, the Tamath, the Kernite, and the Moulton, all feeding into the mighty Andershan, which divides Almas and Andoran itself into distinct eastern and western halves. The many bridges that span the capital's major and minor districts have been constructed with high arches to allow larger vessels smooth passage underneath without fear of collision. We will be taking advantage of this to witness Almas's most significant landmarks and sites all at once. Before I lay bare the specifics of individual attractions, though, I think it would be wise to offer you a brief overview of Andoran as a polity and nation, for otherwise you may overlook its entirely unique place on the world stage. The epithet Birthplace of Freedom is taken very seriously, both here and abroad, albeit for polar opposite reasons. Andoran is a genuinely democratic country, perhaps the only one on Galarian, and certainly the only one in the Inner Sea region. Nations like Absalom may flirt with democratic principles, but they remain fundamentally shackled to aristocracies, oligarchies, and backroom dealings. Not so here, the locals loudly and proudly proclaim. So let us start at the beginning, and approach Almas with a broad yet scrupulous eye. There are many elements we must overlook for now, most notably the Lumber Consortium, but do not worry. We will come to all neglected factions and locations in good time. Welcome to the Law Tour of Andoran. The history of Andoran formally begins in the year 1707 as a province of the Empire of Taldor, when the great general Castalus of Corentin founded the city of Augustana, around 200 miles west of here. The Taldan armies of exploration had recently mapped the region and discovered its breadth of natural resources, particularly darkwood trees, which here alone in all Aveston grew in abundance. The native Kelid peoples were displaced, and the Fae who inhabited the extensive Arthfell, Darkmoon, and Verduran forests quickly found their patience tested. Nevertheless, Andoran flourished. Its stability was not seriously challenged until 4081, when the Taldan governor Aspects the Even-Tongued found himself in control of several armies protecting the Empire's northern provinces. The homeland had recently been invaded by Kadira, and Aspects correctly concluded that he could foster secession in his provinces and install himself as their monarch. The following decade of diplomacy and almost bloodless revolt is remembered as the Even-Tongued Conquest, and Andoran was among the first of the northern provinces to declare itself for Aspects' Cheliax. Thus, its loyalties shifted westwards from Opara to Westcrown. The loss of Eredon in 4606 shook all the nations of the Inner Sea to their core, but Cheliax suffered the most. Even Absalom, the nation founded by the god of humanity, proved more resilient in the end. King Gaspadar I of Cheliax had ruled by divine mandate, you see, and thus his support quickly collapsed following the death of his deity. What followed is remembered as the Chalish Civil War, and it was a brutal, monstrous affair dominated by tyrants and marred by kinslaying. Cheliax's numerous vassal states began to declare their independence, and a wind of change swept through the region. Andoran proved resilient to this revolutionary zeitgeist at first. Then, in 4662, a Gultan philosopher by the name of Dal Ubanich published the treatise On Government, which quickly became one of the most important academic works of all time. It attacked the Chelaxians for their terrible betrayal of humanity by turning to Asmodeus and diabolism, and its remaining provinces were filled with renewed vigor. 7 years later, in 4669, following Galt's own Red Revolution 2 years earlier, Andoran finally declared loyalty to itself in an uprising called the People's Revolt. For an event with so many decades of gradual escalation, its realization was as swift as it was effective. Workers joined forces with merchants and together formed the People's Freedom Movement, committed to bringing egalitarianism to all corners of the land. Governors, lords, and ladies were isolated, their estates surrounded, their fields boycotted. Armed revolutionaries occupied Almas, Augustana, Oregont, and every other strategically important settlement in the region, and thence dispersed their power outwards into the Carpentern Plains and the Darkmoon Vale. Within a matter of months, all Andoran was seized, or reclaimed, depending on your perspective. Crucially, however, this incredible momentum was checked by the movement's rejection of needless violence, relying instead on their overwhelming numbers to enforce change. With the exception of a few unfortunate incidents involving particularly neglected peasants and their pitchforks, the ruling class was dislodged carefully, rather like removing a tick from the body. Compare this approach with the one chosen by Galt, which enjoyed violent, bloody rebellion so much that to this day its citizenry instigates a new one every few years or so. Here in Andoran, those nobles who voluntarily surrendered their lands, titles, and privileges were welcomed into the movement as equal partners in a brave new nation, and indeed they were often even permitted to retain their primary residence at the cost of their remaining domains. Even the few who refused the freedom movement's demands were not put to the sword, but merely exiled, mostly back to Cheliax proper to face the judgment of House Thrun, which retaliated by instigating an embargo on all Andoran goods. Still, by the end of the year, a new nation was born. I will remind you that the People's Revolt occurred only 54 years ago, well within living memory even for humans. Thus, there has been no shortage of skeptics from within and without this country who scoff at the idea of a sustainable People's Republic. They point to Galt and its endless violence, or to Absalom and its tired foe representation, or even, if the skeptic is particularly well educated, to ancient Aslant, Eridan's homeland, which experimented briefly with proto-democracy before its ruin. Yet the Andoran people have so far proven themselves to be remarkably resilient to external influence or internal corruption. Its People's Council boasts 350 democratically elected representatives gathered from every corner of the land, who oversee one of the most complex bureaucracies I have ever encountered. Magistrates and commissioners and sheriffs beyond count answer, ultimately, to the council, upholding the principle of accountability to the people, from whom all authority originates. Now, the freedom movement leaders were keenly aware of the dangers of a failed rebellion. It was cardinally important that a strong military was established as soon as possible to deter any violent retaliation from abroad. Luckily for them, their country was home to the Eagle Knights, who were in a unique position to cement the new order. Originally formed as an honor guard for Eridan in anticipation of his return, these elite Andoran warriors were repurposed by the late aristocracy as symbols of nationalism and civic pride in the immediate aftermath of his death. Their original oaths were forsworn and repurposed to protect Andoran and all its peoples, and the knights subsequently proved critical in keeping their country relatively stable during the Chalish Civil War. During this time, the Eagle Knights developed a zealous culture around their new vow, perhaps somewhat humiliated by the loss of their god only 6 years after their formation. Consequently, they upheld their oath during the People's Revolt by remaining steadfastly neutral, refusing the nobility's increasingly frenzied orders to suppress the uprising by force. After the dust settled, the new People's Council repurposed the Eagle Knights yet again with the cooperation of its leadership. Their veteran warriors became a formal branch of the Andoran military, tasked with protecting not only the people, but also with resisting the machinations of tyrants around Galarian. Thus, they were split into 3 branches: the domestic Golden Legion, the errant Steel Falcons, and the clandestine Twilight Talons, though the People's Council officially recognizes only the first 2. Of these, the Steel Falcons have become Andoran's most popular symbol internationally. Their reputation precedes them. They slay slavers and manumit their slaves, and then invite them to settle in Andoran if they would face persecution in their home nations. They joined forces with the Mendevian legions in the north to oppose the demonic incursion of the Worldwound. They embody the virtues of honor and valor wherever they go. If you imagine a righteous, almost naive knight in shining armor, well, That is essentially a steel falcon. I believe the falcons are so popular because, to a certain extent, they represent the very best of their nation. Locals will often tell you about the Andoren Spirit. That is, the resolute commitment to upholding those egalitarian values that distinguish their nation from all others. Andorans have the right to speak their mind without government retaliation, to refuse military service, to travel wherever they will without leave, and to bend the knee only to those whom they deem worthy of the honor. Moreover, Andorans are generally willing to defend those rights through violence, including by decking you in a pub if you begin to question these ideals too loudly. So, if you hail from a part of Galarian that rejects the Andoren Spirit, be very careful in what you say. That said, most of the international animosity towards Andoran does not come from common folk, but rather from the ruling classes, who worry that a stable democracy may inspire others to reproduce the success in their own nations. After all, the people are the many, and the aristocrats are the few. And that brings us back to Almas, the capital. It has a population of around 80,000 people in its dense metropolis, and many more again in the surrounding towns and lands. In fact, Andoran is one of the most densely populated countries in the Inner Sea region, with 2/3 of its population living within a day's ride of Almas proper. It might not be the oldest city in the country, but it is the biggest and the loudest. Allow me to quote from the popular wayfarer's guide, Spirit of Liberty. When foreigners speak of Andoran's arrogance, they mean Almas. When they spit and snarl about the gilt temples to mob rule, they mean Almas. When they talk about slaves rubbing shoulders with free men, half-breeds walking with purebloods, or commoners acting like kings, they mean Almas. Everything such people hate about Andoran is typified in Almas, and as the city has grown from a provincial seat to one of the major powers in Aveston and beyond, the character of Almas has changed accordingly. So, in many ways, Almas culture has become Andoran's culture. You will find that the Andoran spirit does not seem so noble in the rugged Wolfren Hills, or shine so brightly in the Darkmoon Wood. But that is not something a local to Almas would readily admit. As always, the truth is far more complicated. And that is why I am here, dear stranger. It seems our first landmark is coming up on our left, so let us make this our transition point from Andoran as a country to Almas as a city. Go now below and gather your belongings. When you return, I will hold forth on the city itself, and its nuances, traditions, and secrets will be laid bare to you. Well, until then.